Bernstein Show. Now, here's Ed.
Well, I recently have seen a documentary here in Las Vegas that was produced by Ashley Avis and Edward Winter regarding wild horses. The name of the film is Wild Beauty, and I guess, is it Ed or Edward, do I call you?
Ed's fine, but whatever's easiest. We don't need too much confusion between the two of us.
The two Eds, yeah, well, yeah, the old saying that two Eds are better than none, right? But Ed, you and Ashley, can one of you explain, just summarize what the film is about, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more.
Sure. So Wild Beauty, Mustang Spirit of the West is a merger between a cinematic look at wild horses across our Western public lands, and it's also a journalistic expose into the corruption that is befalling them at the hands of the federal agency, essentially tasked to protect them.
This actually is of particular importance here in Nevada. Why?
Nevada has over half of the wild horse population in the Western U.S., and it's been incredible. Your state has the support of Congresswoman Dina Titus, who has been instrumental in raising awareness for wild horses, and she introduced a helicopter bill last year that didn't pass. She's reintroducing that helicopter bill this year, which would, if it is successful, would ground the use of helicopters in these roundups, because a lot of people are very up in arms. And this is what we're hoping to show with our documentary, that in 2023, we can't be treating wild horses or wild species in a cruel and antiquated manner with the use of an aircraft.
Now, we have a trailer from your movie. I think it's probably a good time to show it so our viewers can get some idea of what we're really talking about. So let's go forward with the video.
I'll never forget the first time that I saw a wild horse. It was right at the edge of dawn. And I thought they looked like ghosts.
This is an area that used to have thousands and thousands of wild horses.
There has been an aggressive roundup and removal of huge numbers of wild horses on our public lands.
There are lobbying dollars in Washington, D.C. that we're up against. It's a David and Goliath situation.
It takes the accountability out of the system.
If the United States follows its own laws, they would be protected by the Endangered Species Act.
This kind of injustice is happening all around the country.
And it should terrify every single American who cares about wild horses.
Sweetheart, run.
We're asking you, Mr. President, stop this roundup.
They go across the border, and once they go across the border, they don't come back.
It's a policy that puts small farmers out of business.
It diverts the public's attention away from the effects of overgrazing by commercial livestock.
Stop the choppers! Stop the choppers!
I'm not sure what we're about to encounter.
Oh my God.
I can hear them crying.
We've been listening to it for hours.
We want to keep you here. It's some conspiracy.
This is a government agency that is broken.
Just keep rolling.
So as you can see from that video, this is a critical problem. Now, can you explain a little bit, Ed or Ashley, about what is so upsetting regarding helicopters and horses?
Horses are a flight animal. Wild and domestic horses are flight animals, and they're highly intelligent. They're very, very closely bonded with their families. And using an aircraft to chase wild horses many times for many grueling miles is inhumane. These helicopter roundups often result in injuries, some of them fatal, and it's just not a way that we should be treating a species in this day and age. And few people know that we even have wild horses in our country, but fewer people know that they're actually federally protected. And what is going on right now with these helicopter roundups goes directly against the 1971 Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act that Nixon signed into law, which states that wild horses should be prevented from capture, branding, harassment, and death. And that is exactly what the Bureau of Land Management is doing right now in these wild horse roundups.
It's also a bit unnecessary. I mean, if you consider that many of these horses can be found frequently next to water, they don't need to be chased to be corralled, not in this manner anyway. There are bait and trap options that are not being utilized. You see in the documentary that the one day upon returning for the next day of roundups, a large number of the horses were standing near the trap site that they would be eventually chased into. So it just feels like a bit of overkill from our perspective.
There is developed a business around this. Isn't that one of the problems here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I often say when something doesn't make sense from an ecological standpoint, but an economical standpoint as well, you kind of got to follow the money. And it's one of these situations where it would actually cost the taxpayer less to subsidize cattle grazing outside of our public lands. And the Bureau of Land Management continues to use the same contractors who have, been awarded millions of dollars in government contracts. One in particular, over $30 million in government contracts to round up these horses. So they don't want that cash flow to stop. And we're kind of very much on the other side saying, why are our tax dollars going to these roundups that just don't need to be executed? We don't think they need to be executed at all, but they certainly don't need to be executed in the aggressive manner that they are.
What would be the argument by the government on why the roundups are necessary? What is their position?
It's a very well done misinformation campaign, in our opinion, and in our experience of spending 5 years on the road documenting all of this and questioning the BLM. Their reasoning, which if people have heard that we have wild horses, their reasoning is a repetitive narrative where they say wild horses, it's a blanket statement. Wild horses are starving, they're overpopulated, there's drought, and we're rounding them up for their own good. And what's actually happening, where you'll go out to one of these wild horse herd management areas where they are supposed to be protecting the wild horses and managing them on those lands, they're removing them, but then allowing thousands of cattle and sheep to graze on the land. So in numerous instances where we went to these roundups, we documented roundups across the country, but in particular, some very iconic herds in Utah and Colorado. You would go out there, the roundup would happen, they would strip the horses down to genetically unsustainable numbers, and then a few months later or a few weeks later, thousands of sheep would show up or hundreds of cattle would show up. And livestock graze very differently than horses. They tear up the plant. They're not very picky eaters. So you set loose cattle or sheep on public lands and they're destroying that natural ecological balance. Whereas horses are like lawnmowers. They don't rip up the root. So it's a problem in a number of, it's not just a problem with wild horses, it's a problem with land health across the Western United States as the Bureau of Land Management allows overgrazing by livestock and in the process is wiping out wild horses.
I suspect that there's more money in cattle and sheep than there is in horses. Is that really at the heart of this? Absolutely.
I mean, there's tourism in some areas, but it's hard to go out and find the horses in some of these places. But that's also the beauty of what we're trying to promote as well, that wild horses exist in our country. And that's such an incredible thing to go out there and enjoy on our public lands.
And you two, in filming this documentary, traveled over, 20,000 miles and we were in 13 different states. And while you're traveling to all these different states and viewing all these roundups and all of the grazing, did you see a lot of these horses that were starving that the government's referring to?
No, we did not. No. We did not.
No. So they're paying people to round them up. These people, I assume, are also in the cattle and sheep business as well. So they're
the Bureau of Land Management is a government agency, but they're certainly tied to the cattle and sheep ranchers as the organization that is responsible for executing these roundups.
So there's kind of a lobbying thing where they just have greater power. These ranchers have greater power and greater influence with the Bureau of Land Management to to really, give preference to the cattle and the sheep, and not to the detriment of wild horses, is what I see is happening.
That is what's happening. And then that's having this massive ripple effect into other species as well. They're wiping out the wild horses, but they're also wiping out natural predators like wolves and mountain lions. And that's disturbing the natural ecological balance for a number of other species. You look at what happened with Yellowstone when they reintroduced the wolves, and those areas started to thrive because balance was restored. And so what they're doing is continuing to disturb and really wipe out that balance. And you go out to some of these places where the cattle have overgrazed, and they look like moonscapes. You don't have anything left, and it takes a long time for those areas to come back. And then that also, when cattle overgraze and they wipe out the natural, they wipe out those natural plants and sagebrush, it introduces, there's been an infestation of cheatgrass, which is highly flammable, and it's led to wildfires. So it's this big ripple effect that obviously in our documentary, the conduit, really, the heart of it is wild horses, but it speaks to something much bigger and broader that's happening on our public lands.
And of course, I should say now, if people want to view the documentary, view your film, how would they go about doing that?
The Wild Beauty is now on iTunes. It's on Amazon Prime, Spectrum, and a variety of TVOD platforms. I believe it's on YouTube as well. So if you type in Wild Beauty Mustang Spirit of the West, chances are it's on one of your providers.
What is the win-win here, Ashley? Why can't, we all get along? How do horses, survive properly on some land, and cattle and sheep on different lands? And how does it all work for everybody?
I think there needs to be a very hard look, and not a biased look, at how many cattle should be allowed to graze on Western public lands, because right now it's overgrazing, and that's been a repetitious pattern that the BLM has allowed over years. So to us, we feel like there needs to be much more oversight of the Bureau of Land Management. There needs to, they basically set something called an AML, an appropriate management level, with wild horses, and they have driven these numbers so low. And to us, we feel, and this is our opinion, that it's being knowingly done, that they're placing the approved wild horse population numbers to numbers that are so low that they're genetically unsustainable. And therefore, if they drive them that low, eventually they're going to wipe themselves out. So I think that the Bureau of Land Management really needs to be investigated, because there's too much of a bias within the agency for there to be any balance that can be struck. And then obviously the argument is up against the cattle lobby. Wild horses are up against the cattle lobby, and there's a lot of money there. So it's an uphill battle. But with the film, we felt indebted to try to use our voices to at least raise some awareness, so that people know this is happening and can say this is wrong and we need to stop it.
How many wild horses are we talking about?
So the BLM's numbers state there are about 80,000 horses on the range. Over the years with the roundups, a lot of organizations believe there are closer to 60,000. And right now we have approximately 60,000 wild horses in burrows in government holding facilities. And some of these places, I mean, you saw them in the documentary, they're awful. They're highly compressed. The horses can't gallop properly. Some of these places don't have shade. If people saw the way wild horses are being treated after they get rounded up, and the helicopter roundups are, awful enough to see, but then they have to live out their lives incarcerated in that manner. It's pretty despicable, in my opinion.
And when you consider that whether it's 80,000 or 60,000, let's just say it's under 100,000, and then 2 million cattle are released on these lands every year, and then that doesn't account for however many million sheep are also set out on these public lands. So when the Bureau of Land Management states that it's the wild horse that is causing degradation to the land, it's a very strange equation to try to understand 80,000 versus millions.
Yeah, and we have 200 It's important to note we have 245 million acres of public land. When you go out to these places looking for the horses, you're looking at miles and miles of just flat land or mountains. You know, the BLM likes to say, oh my gosh, we have 80,000 horses. They're overpopulated. That's just absurd when you actually consider the amount of public land, and they've allocated about 27 million acres for wild horses. But it's, you know, they're a drop in the bucket, and the way the BLM skews talking about the overpopulation is frankly absurd.
And you referenced earlier that, you know, they're pack animals, which means that you just can't really separate them, which is another issue, right? I mean, I hate to equate it to families, but you know, in a way that's very similar. I mean, there is a connection and there is a consequence to separating out these wild horses. Can you talk about that?
It's devastating, because I think people are much more aware now, which is very good, that animals are empathetic, animals are intelligent, and you see and witness these roundups where a stallion, which is basically a father, is not captured, and we've witnessed stallions running into the trap site trying to get their families back, or trying to fight to keep their families together. And it's really, really traumatic and awful for these tightly bonded families of horses, because they are families. I mean, I'm glad you used that word, because I think it's arrogant for humans to think we're the only ones that feel that way toward the members of our pack, our family. And then when they get into the holding facilities, they separate the stallions from the mares, and they castrate the males, and now they're introducing fertility control, irreversible fertility control, which is really just completely destroying the natural dynamics of these horses out on the range, which is just going to continue to lead to the eradication of the species. But
now, I noticed in the film, it seemed to me kind of like your film crew and people who were concerned about how the horses were being treated were at odds with the government. I mean, it seemed to me as if they were not allowing you access to some of the public facilities. I mean, these are public facilities, I would think, right? We pay for them. We're taxpayers. They were just very difficult and, for sure, not transparent.
They certainly weren't transparent, and that's what we were up against at every roundup that we went to some degree. They usually hide the trap site completely from public viewing, because when the helicopter descends on the herd of horses, and you have a lot of horses sometimes being rounded up, I mean, that's a stampede. And then they will stampede them into this very small network of pens, usually. And that's where horses are colliding with each other, where babies are getting trampled. These horses break their legs, their necks. They're trying to jump out of the pens. They're trying to find their families. It can get violent. And the Bureau of Land Management still considers this practice humane. And so what we experienced quite a bit, obviously, with our cameras, they didn't want us documenting any of that. And so even when we would say, we're out here with a lens the size of, a National Geographic documentary, we don't need to go 5 feet away. We can be a mile away, but just on the other side of the mountain. And yes, Ed, on our public lands, we have the right as observers, as journalists, to document that. And they will cite safety reasons, or we're sorting the horses. There's nothing about sorting horses that should prevent a team of journalists and documentarians from being a mile away on the right side of the mountain. And then, as you saw in the documentary, in one of the roundups that we witnessed, there was a small child in the cockpit of the helicopter during the government roundup of those horses. She was maybe 8 years old, and I work with kids. I mean, a little girl doing aerial maneuvers, or in the chopper with her father, or her whomever he was, doing these maneuvers that you couldn't do on a film set. I mean, that's just dangerous. But how?
And on the back of the water truck, right next to the recently rounded up horses, and all while we're being told we can't go any closer at all due to safety, our safety, and not the horse's safety. So it's a bit contradictory. And when you look at that roundup specifically, it was delayed slightly for for a case. There was a decision that was made on whether or not they would be able to move forward with the case. And when that trial, that hearing was taking place, the BLM testified under oath that how the horses were being rounded up due to unhealthy body condition and lack of forage. And then 3 days into the roundup, changed their narrative, admitted that they were wrong, and decided that the roundup was now because of drought. So they just literally lie under oath and then say, we'll just change the reason. It's just all kind of arbitrary and made up.
I know that you've worked on some other horse-related films. You did something with Black Beauty, with the remake of Black Beauty.
Yeah.
And
Black Beauty and Disney Plus.
The same Black Beauty that I saw as a kid, was classic book and movie, and then you remade it, or what was that?
We did a reimagining of Black Beauty, which was one of the books that inspired me to love horses as a kid, just like millions of other people around the world. And our version of Black Beauty is a modern day reimagining. So few people know that Anna Sewell actually wrote that novel as an animal welfare plea to try to protect the horses of her time in the late 1800s, the cab horses and the carriage horses. And so in modernizing the classic, we wanted to tie a modern day issue to help horses of our time. And that's when we came across the issues wild horses were facing.
I know in Nevada, there was a period of time that they were encouraging people to adopt horses and burros. Were we still doing that or not? Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it's mixed. I think right now, adopting a wild horse is very expensive and it's very difficult. The wild horses often require a lot of training if they want to assimilate into the world of humans at all. And some of them do. Some of them are wonderful therapy horses. We've seen a lot of success stories, and we rescue horses when we can, because in my opinion, anything is better than those holding facilities where they're incarcerated. But the reality is, getting 60,000 horses out of government holding is probably unrealistic anytime soon. And so it is of our opinion that rewilding needs to happen. Some of these herd management areas that have been zeroed out by the Bureau of Land Management to put cattle and sheep on the range, the cattle and sheep need to come off, and it needs to be returned to a wild horse herd management area. And but there are some wonderful programs that are trying, or sanctuaries that are able to get some of the horses out. But there's also an issue that the BLM has really allowed to happen, called the Adoption Incentive Program, where if you go to a holding facility, we adopted 2 horses, for example, out of Palomino Valley, and you pay $25 a horse, and the government gives you $1,000, $500 upon adoption, $500 after a year. Then they give you a title for those horses, and you can essentially do what you want with them. And so some duplicitous people, and the New York Times did a great article about this. Some duplicitous people will buy several of them, or family members will buy several of them. They'll throw them out to pasture for a year. They'll get the titles and flip them into the auction pipeline, which leads to slaughter in Mexico and Canada. So thousands of wild horses have ended up in unfathomably horrific conditions and fates because of that program.
And finish where you were going with that comment. Is they lead them to slaughter for what purpose?
For human consumption in China.
To eat in China. We're sending horse meat over to China. And these horses, you said half of them are in Nevada. Where in Nevada are they?
Oh, they're everywhere. I mean, one of our favorite places was Triple B. And that's where our first 2 rescue horses were from. Just beautiful different colors of wild horses. And just, Triple B is so expansive. I think it's over 1 million acres. And
area outside of Ely, up north.
Yeah. So some of these places are more remote, and some of them, you can find the horses within an hour right off the road. And I think that's what's magnificent about Nevada, at least right now, where you guys have more wild horses than anywhere else. And that needs to be protected. And not just for us, but for our kids and future generations to get to see that.
So what do you hope to accomplish with the film? Obviously, you want people to be aware of what's going on, and what is it that you want people to do about it?
We're asking people right now, our call to action is awareness. We're asking people to share the trailer for Wild Beauty Mustang Spirit of the West with the hashtag I Stand With Wild Horses. If you want to take a step further, please tag your members of Congress. Dina Titus has been such a friend to the wild horses. We really thank the Congresswoman for everything she's done. And then if people want to take another step further, they can call their members of Congress and encourage them to support and advocate for a hearing to stop the roundups. And we're very much hoping that people start talking about the Congresswoman's helicopter bill to stop the use of helicopters. So all of those calls, some people say, well, it's just one voice. I'm just one voice. It takes only a few minutes to make that call. And if we get thousands of people asking for the same thing, they listen. And that's what happened in Colorado when Governor Polis got so many calls on behalf of wild horses that he stepped up and was instrumental in supporting the roundup of the San Wash Basin horses to end early. So it does work. And it only takes a few minutes of time to stand up for these horses.
So hopefully Congresswoman Titus, is she introducing a bill, or?
She's reintroducing a bill to ban the use of helicopters in roundups, yes.
So we're hoping that it passes the House, goes to the Senate, and would be signed by the President to really protect some of these horses and change the behavior of the Bureau of Land Management as it currently exists regarding wild horses and birds. Ashley, thank you very much. Edward, Ed, and Eddie.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much. Once again, we're going to put the website on the screen so people can view the trailer themselves and if you want to view the film, it's available as well. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.